Go ahead and just get started. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's informational webinar for Track 1 of the Ocean Protection Council's Senate Bill 1 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Grant Program. My name is Megan Williams. I'm the Coastal Resilience Program Manager within OPC's Climate Change Program. We also have several OPC staff joining us today who will be monitoring the chat and helping us with the Q&A at the end of the presentation. We have about an hour set aside for today's webinar. We'll spend the first portion walking through the updated Track 1 program materials and application process, and then we will leave time at the end for questions. Before we dive in, I just want to quickly cover a few webinar logistics. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be posted on OPC's SB1 funding webpage after the webinar. We'll hold questions until the end of the presentation, but during that Q&A, you can either type questions into the chat or use the raise hand function to be unmuted. We do ask that you please reserve very project-specific or applicant-specific questions for email at opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov so that we can really provide a more complete response and tailor it specific to your situation. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So this is an outline of the material that we'll be covering today. We'll start with a brief overview of OPC, Senate Bill 1, and the SB1 grant program, including the current funding available, solicitation, timeline, applicant eligibility, and the priorities for Track 1. We will then spend some time walking through the updated Track 1 structure, including the 3 project pathways, the revised Sea Level Rise adaptation criteria, and how applicants should determine which application pathway applies to their project. After that, we will cover the application process itself, proposal requirements, and next steps. And then I will pass it over to our Senate Bill 1 Technical Assistance Program team to provide an overview of the TA program itself and how to apply for assistance. And then finally, we will wrap up with the Q&A. So just starting off with a little bit about who we are, the Ocean Protection Council is a cabinet-level state agency charged with protecting, conserving, and maintaining California's ocean and coastal resources for the benefit of current and future generations. OPC really works at the intersection of science, policy, and management. Our role includes recommending policy, promoting coordination across agencies, seeking and leveraging funding, and helping ensure that state decision-making is informed by the best available science. One of our most important documents here at OPC, and the document that lays out our current priorities, is our 2026 to 2030 strategic plan. The SB1 grant program directly supports the goals and targets in that plan, particularly our work to build resilience to sea level rise, coastal storms, erosion, and flooding. So as you are developing a proposal, I do encourage you to take a look at the strategic plan and think about how your project advances those broader OPC priorities. For Track 1 specifically, the one we're talking about here today, this solicitation really helps implement Target 1.1.2, which focuses on advancing comprehensive sea level rise adaptation planning across California's coast and San Francisco Bay. So to provide some background on this grant program specifically, in 2021, Governor Newsom signed Senate Bill 1 into law. SB1 directs OPC to provide funding to local and regional governments for sea level rise adaptation planning and implementation projects. While a significant amount of sea level rise planning has already occurred along California's coast, planning approaches and standards have varied across jurisdictions. So in recognition of those inconsistencies and the urgency of preparing for sea level rise, Senate Bill 272 was signed into law in 2023. SB 272 requires coastal local governments to adopt sea level rise adaptation plans by January 1st, 2034. For outer coast jurisdictions, those plans must ultimately be integrated into local coastal programs, or LCPs, while in the San Francisco Bay Area, they are developed as sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans, or SAPs. In terms of funding, OPC received $37.5 million in greenhouse gas reduction funds in 2022 to support implementation of SB1. And in 2025, OPC also received a $75 million allocation through Proposition 4, that 2024 climate bond, to support the SB1 grant program. So the overall goal of OPC's SB1 grant program is to support implementation of Senate Bill 1 by advancing sea level rise adaptation planning and implementation efforts across California's coast and San Francisco Bay. So as we are going through the webinar and we're getting into the application process, I just want to keep that broader goal in mind, supporting coastal communities and building resilience to sea level rise through coordinated, consistent, and equitable adaptation efforts. To achieve that overall program goal, the SB1 grant program includes Track 1 for Sea Level Rise adaptation planning and Track 2 for Sea Level Rise implementation projects, as well as a separate tribal cultural resources funding program. Track 1 supports Sea Level Rise adaptation planning through a rolling, quarterly, non-competitive process, provided proposals meet the Sea Level Rise adaptation criteria and solicitation requirements. Track 2 supports implementation projects through a separate competitive process that's subject to funding availability, but is typically planned to be released annually. And the Tribal Cultural Resources Funding Program provides dedicated support for California Native American tribes to plan for Sea Level Rise impacts to cultural resources and ancestral lands. For the rest of today's webinar, I'm going to be focusing specifically on Track 1 and the updated planning framework and the application process. For Track 1 of the SB1 grant program, I have just provided a quick funding overview here. Track 1 requests generally range from $200,000 to $1.5 million, with higher amounts considered with strong justification. And the standard maximum project length is 2 years, though longer projects can be considered again with justification. Track 1 proposals are accepted on a rolling, quarterly, non-competitive basis. And by non-competitive, we mean that proposals are not ranked against one another during a single funding round. Instead, each proposal is evaluated based on whether it meets the requirements of the solicitation and the Sea Level Rise adaptation criteria. The next proposal deadline is September 11th, 2026, but applicants that are watching this recording later should check our SB1 funding webpage for the most current proposal deadlines, funding availability, office hours, and other program updates. So here's just a bit more about how the rolling quarterly process works. Full proposals are generally due about 10 to 12 weeks before an OPC meeting. For each quarterly deadline, the SB1 funding webpage identifies the earliest council meeting at which a proposal may be considered for funding approval. After proposals are submitted, they go through an administrative and technical review, and that consists of OPC staff reviewing proposals against the solicitation requirements and the evaluation criteria. And proposals are also reviewed by the appropriate regulatory agency, either the California Coastal Commission staff for Outer Coast projects or BCDC staff for San Francisco Bay Area projects. And that's to help assess alignment with the applicable planning requirements and framework. Depending on the proposal and whether any follow-up or clarification is needed, that review takes place in the weeks leading up to the associated council meeting. Projects that are recommended for funding after that process are then prepared for consideration by the Ocean Protection Council. If approved, grantees work with OPC staff to finalize the grant work plan and agreement, with projects generally beginning within a few months of council approval. Because Track 1 operates on a rolling quarterly basis, additional proposal deadlines and associated council meeting dates are added over time. So again, applicants should check the SB1 funding webpage for the most current schedule. For Track 1 funding, applicants will use the full proposal template that's available on our SB1 funding webpage. This template includes the instructions for each section of the application, including the page limits and required supplemental materials. I will walk through this proposal template and application requirements in more detail later in the webinar, but for now, I just wanted to flag that applicants should use this most current version of the template that's posted on our SB1 funding webpage. Okay, so getting into who's actually eligible and getting into the solicitation itself. So applicants eligible for Track 1 funding include local governments, regional governments, and federally recognized tribal governments. Organizations or consultants may also apply on behalf of an eligible government entity, but in those cases, the application must clearly demonstrate the government's support and collaboration through a letter of commitment. This is particularly important to highlight because Track 1 projects are intended to advance comprehensive, jurisdiction-wide Sea Level Rise adaptation planning, and where applicable, help those local governments meet their planning requirements under Senate Bill 272. So we really want to see that the relevant government entity is meaningfully engaged in and committed to the proposed work, not simply just named as a partner. Okay, so what are the priorities of Track 1? OPC intends for the SB1 grant program, again, overall, to ensure that communities are along California's coast and San Francisco Bay are preparing for Sea Level Rise through consistent and equitable planning process. At the same time, we do recognize that jurisdictions are at a very different stage of Sea Level Rise planning depending on the area. Some are just beginning with vulnerability assessments or community visioning, while others are much further along and are working towards comprehensive adaptation plans and implementation. So track 1 is designed to support jurisdictions wherever they are at in that process, while still making sure that the resulting planning efforts are comprehensive, locally appropriate, and aligned with statewide expectations. So to support jurisdictions wherever they're at in the planning process, Track 1 now organizes eligible projects into 3 pathways. Part 1 covers Outer Coast projects. That includes vulnerability assessments, community visioning and engagement planning, data and information gathering, and Outer Coast Sea Level Rise adaptation plans. These are for projects that are located along California's Outer Coast. Part 2 covers San Francisco Bay Area projects, where the core project type is a single jurisdiction or multi-jurisdictional sub-regional shoreline adaptation plan, or SAP, developed in alignment with BCDC's Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan guidelines. And Part 3 covers sector-specific adaptation plans, which allows applicants to focus more deeply on a particular sector or system when that type of focus planning is needed. And for a sector-specific adaptation plan, that can be a project that's either on the Outer Coast or within the San Francisco Bay Area. I will walk through each of these 3 pathways in more detail in the next few slides. So to help ensure that the Sea Level Rise adaptation planning, not just where they're at in the planning process, but is comprehensive and consistent across jurisdictions, OPC, in collaboration with the California Sea Level Rise State and Regional Support Collaborative, developed the Sea Level Rise adaptation criteria. The criteria establish standardized minimum requirements for Track 1 planning efforts so that projects across jurisdictions are comprehensive, consistent, and aligned with the appropriate state planning framework. The updated criteria are organized across the 3 Track 1 pathways that we just discussed: Outer Coast projects, San Francisco Bay Area projects, and sector-specific adaptation plans. For Outer Coast projects, the criteria complement Coastal Commission guidance. For Bay Area projects, they reflect BCDC's RSAP framework and serve as a checklist for developing a SAP proposal. Applicants should assume that the applicable criteria are required. However, we do recognize that a criterion may not apply because of either a unique local condition or because the work has already been completed through a prior planning effort. So in those cases, applicants can provide a clear justification explaining why that criterion is not listed in the proposed scope. Okay, so to get into a little bit more detail about these different project types and where you'll find the different criteria listed for each of these. Part 1 covers projects along California's Outer Coast. We do recognize, again, that jurisdictions are at different stages of the adaptation planning process, so the funding can support several different types of planning work depending on what a jurisdiction needs to move forward. This can include developing or updating a vulnerability assessment, conducting community visioning and engagement planning, or completing data and information gathering to fill an identified gap needed for a vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan. Importantly, data collection is not intended to be a standalone effort. It should directly support one of those broader planning efforts, either vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan effort. Track 1 can also support development of a comprehensive Outer Coast Sea Level Rise adaptation plan, which brings that work together to identify and evaluate adaptation strategies and establish a plan forward for implementation. All of these different project types can be combined within a single proposal, and applicants are encouraged to advance as far through the planning process as is appropriate and feasible for their jurisdiction. For example, a proposal may include targeted data collection or vulnerability assessment work, and then continue into development of an Outer Coast Sea Level Rise adaptation plan. Standalone pre-planning projects are eligible, but proposals that build toward a comprehensive adaptation plan are strongly encouraged where the jurisdiction is ready to do so. At the same time, a really important principle throughout these updated materials is that proposals should build on existing work rather than duplicate it. If a jurisdiction already has a relatively recent vulnerability assessment that's largely usable, we generally do not want the jurisdiction to redo the entire assessment simply because 1 or 2 components need to be updated. Instead, the proposal should focus on filling in those specific gaps or making the updates necessary to move the jurisdiction's adaptation planning forward. The Outer Coast pathway is also intended to be informed by coordination with California Coastal Commission. If you are not sure which project type is appropriate, what planning work is still needed, or how your proposed project should relate to your local coastal program, LCP, we strongly encourage that you connect with the Coastal Commission staff early in your project development. The Coastal Commission has a coordination request form that applicants can use to initiate that conversation. That process can help applicants and commission staff discuss existing planning work, identify remaining needs, and think through how the proposed SB1 project can best support the jurisdiction's broader sea level rise adaptation and LCP planning efforts. Ultimately, these Outer Coast project types are intended to support comprehensive jurisdiction-wide sea level rise adaptation planning with the eventual goal of informing and being incorporated into a jurisdiction's LCP or other applicable land use plan. Part 2 covers San Francisco Bay Area projects. For jurisdictions that are located within the Bay Area, Track 1 funding is intended to support development of sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans, or SAPs, in alignment with BCDC's Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP. Applicants may propose either a single jurisdiction SAP or a multi-jurisdictional SAP, depending on the scale of the planning effort and the jurisdictions that are involved. Multi-jurisdictional planning may be especially appropriate where shoreline vulnerabilities, infrastructure, ecosystems, or flood risks cross jurisdictional boundaries. For Bay Area applicants, the RSAP should be your primary reference for planning requirements and completion standards. Our sea level rise adaptation criteria reflect that RSAP framework, and it's just intended to help applicants scope an SB1 proposal, but they do not replace BCDC's RSAP guidelines and minimum standards. The criteria are organized around RSAP elements A through G, covering the planning process, existing conditions, vulnerability assessment, adaptation strategies and pathways, land use and policy, implementation and funding, and the priority project list. Applicants should use those elements to identify the work that still needs to be completed as part of the SAP. A really important point here is that the SAP is the core project type. We are not treating individual RSAP elements as separate standalone project types. The intent is for the proposal to advance a complete SAP while recognizing and building on planning work that may already exist. And then where that prior work already satisfies an RSAP requirement, applicants should not duplicate it, similar to Part 1, but instead the proposal should focus on the remaining work that's needed to complete the SAP. Equity is also a foundational requirement of the RSAP, so outreach, engagement, and identification of vulnerable communities should be integrated through the SAP planning process and inform the development of each element of the plan. So ultimately, proposals under Part 2 should be structured to produce a SAP that is ready for consideration by the relevant City Council or County Board of Supervisors, and that can then move forward for BCDC consideration under SB 272. BCDC consideration may occur after the grant term, but the grant-funded work should really get the jurisdiction to a complete, locally reviewable SAP. BCDC staff have developed a very comprehensive webinar series on the RSAP and the SAP process, which walks through the framework, individual elements, and expectations for local jurisdictions. So if you are new to the RSAP or you're still trying to work through how the process applies to your jurisdiction, I strongly recommend reviewing those webinars and other BCDC resources before developing your proposal. And our final part is Part 3, which covers sector-specific adaptation plans. This pathway is available for both Outer Coast and San Francisco Bay Area projects, and it's intended for situations where there is a significant sea level rise vulnerability or adaptation planning need associated with a particular sector. So these sector-specific adaptation plans allow applicants to take a deeper look at the vulnerabilities, adaptation options, and implementation needs for a particular sector or system. Depending on the jurisdiction, that could include things like critical infrastructure, public access, ecosystems, contaminated sites, or another sector with a demonstrated need for focused adaptation planning. Importantly, these plans should complement and inform broader jurisdiction-wide sea level rise adaptation planning rather than function as an isolated planning effort. So applicants should explain how the sector-specific adaptation plan relates to existing or future jurisdiction-wide plan, and how the work will help advance the jurisdiction's overall resilience to sea level rise. Because these projects are more specialized, there is a slightly different application process. Applicants interested in a sector-specific adaptation plan must first submit a letter of intent, or LOI, before developing a full proposal. This gives OPC staff just an opportunity to review the proposed concept and determine whether the sector-specific pathway is appropriate before the applicant invests a lot of time in preparing a full application. If we do determine that the proposed project is a good fit for this pathway, the applicant will then be invited to submit a full Track 1 proposal. Okay, so now that we have walked through the 3 pathways in a little bit more detail, I just want to pause here and make the application process for each one really clear, because there are, again, slightly different requirements depending on the type of project you're proposing. For an Outer Coast project, applicants should complete the Track 1 full proposal template and identify the applicable Outer Coast project type or types within the proposal. For San Francisco Bay Area projects, applicants must complete the same Track 1 full proposal template. And if you're proposing a single jurisdiction or multi-jurisdictional SAP, you will also need to complete the SAP supplemental questionnaire as part of your proposal package, and that is linked in the proposal template itself. For sector-specific adaptation plans, the process starts differently. Applicants should first submit a letter of intent rather than the full proposal. OPC will review the concept, and if the project's determined to be appropriate for this pathway, then we will invite the applicant to move forward with the full proposal, which will then be using the Track 1 full proposal template. And then one other distinction I just want to reinforce is data and information gathering. This is an eligible Outer Coast project type, but it is not intended to be a standalone data collection effort. That proposed work needs to be and address an identified information gap that supports either a vulnerability assessment or an adaptation plan for the Outer Coast. So do not submit a full proposal template just doing data and information gathering. So when deciding how to apply, start by identifying which of these 3 pathways your project falls under, review the applicable section of the Silverized adaptation criteria, and then make sure that you're using the corresponding application materials. And if you're looking at these pathways and you're not sure where your project fits, or you need support just thinking through your scope, the Silverized criteria, or the application process itself, is exactly the kind of support our technical assistance program can provide. And we'll be hearing from the TA team shortly after I walk through the application process and proposal template. Okay, so again, we do recognize that jurisdictions are at very different stages of Silverized planning. Some may be starting with vulnerability assessment, doing community visioning, engagement planning. Others may be ready to move directly into a comprehensive adaptation plan or SAP. And again, Track 1 is intended to support that range of planning needs. So to apply, applicants should first very carefully review both the Track 1 solicitation and the Silverized adaptation criteria. The solicitation explains and goes over the eligibility, the proposal requirements, how proposals will be evaluated, and the Silverized adaptation criteria outline the minimum planning requirements for each project pathway. Again, for Outer Coast projects in San Francisco Bay Area SAPs, applicants should complete the SB1 Track 1 proposal template and instructions. Bay Area applicants should also submit that SAP supplemental questionnaire. For sector-specific adaptation plans, first complete that LOI, and OPC will review it and determine whether the appropriate next step is either consultation maybe, or an invitation to submit a full proposal. Completed proposal packages should be submitted to opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov using the subject line shown in the proposal template at the very top. The next proposal deadline is September 11th, 2026, but applicants that are watching this recording later should check the SB1 funding webpage for the most current proposal deadlines and application materials. All of these documents that I've mentioned throughout here are available on our SB1 funding webpage, and we will put that link in the chat if it's not already there. Okay, so getting into what the actual proposal template looks like. Here is an overview of the template. Section 1 is the cover page. This is where you'll provide basic project and applicant information, including who's the lead entity, the requested funding amount, project duration, and information for any subcontractors that will be part of the project team. This is also where you will check the boxes and identify the applicable Track 1 project pathway and project type or components, whether that's an Outer Coast project, a San Francisco Bay Area SAP, or sector-specific adaptation plan. Section 2 is the application completeness checklist. I strongly recommend revisiting this checklist before submitting your proposal package to make sure all the required sections and any applicable supplemental materials are included. Some items are conditional. For example, the nonprofit organization pre-award questionnaire is only required if the lead applicant is a nonprofit. And the SAP supplemental questionnaire is required for the Bay Area SAP proposals. Starting with section 3 is the main proposal narrative. For sections 3 through 7, applicants should respond directly to the prompts and delete the instruction text as they complete the template so that they can make full use of the available page limits. Section 3 itself is the project description. This is where you will provide the project summary, explain the applicable Silverrise adaptation criteria pathway and project types or components, describe the geographic scope, relative need for Silverrise planning and likelihood of success, the community the project will serve, and any tribal partnership. And a project area map is also required. Section 4 is the project work plan. This is where the Silverrise adaptation criteria really come into play. The tasks, subtasks, milestones, and deliverables in the work plan should reflect the applicable minimum requirements outlined in the criteria. So in other words, the criteria should help you actually build the scope of the work, not just be something that you reference separately saying, we will satisfy all Silverrise criteria. Then section 5 provides space for missing criteria justification. Again, applicants should assume that the applicable criteria are required, but if a criterion does not apply because of a unique local condition or because the work has already been completed through a prior planning effort, this is where you can explain that clearly. Section 6 is the project schedule and major deliverables. This is where you'll provide the timeline for your tasks, milestones, and major deliverables. The schedule should line up directly with the work plan, and applicants should make sure that the major deliverables are realistic for the proposed grant term. Section 7 is the budget. When developing your budget, please follow the instructions in the proposal template. Refer to OPC's budget and invoice guide for information on eligible cost categories and costs that cannot be included. Applicants are also required to provide a budget justification that explains how the requested funds are distributed across tasks and why these costs are necessary to complete the work. And then lastly is section 8, which is the supplemental documents. All applicants will include project team, resumes, or CVs, so that's anyone that's already been identified to be on the project. If the lead applicant is a nonprofit organization, the nonprofit organization pre-award questionnaire is also required. And if you are proposing a single jurisdiction or multi-jurisdictional SAP, so under Part 2 in the San Francisco Bay Area, you will also need to complete the SAP supplemental questionnaire. This section also includes project letters. The proposal template explains when letters of commitment are required and when additional letters are optional. For example, if an organization or consultant is applying on behalf of a government entity, a letter of commitment from that government is required. For multi-jurisdictional SAPs, a letter of commitment is required for each participating government or jurisdiction. Additional letters of commitment from either already identified subcontractors, as well as letters of support from the community or others are encouraged, where they help demonstrate coordination, readiness, and broader support for the proposed project, but they are not universally required. Finally, the complete proposal package should be submitted as one PDF, including the completed proposal template and all required supplemental documents. Once a proposal is submitted, it goes through both an administrative and technical review process. First, we review the proposal for completeness and basic eligibility. We then evaluate the proposal using the Track 1 evaluation criteria in the solicitation. So again, I really encourage applicants to review those criteria while developing the proposal, not just after you finished it. Those are the concepts that we were actually going to be looking for and looking at when evaluating the strength and readiness of the proposed project. We also review the proposed scope against the applicable Silverrise adaptation criteria to make sure that the project incorporates the minimum planning requirements for that pathway, or that the applicant has adequately justified any criteria that are not applicable. Proposals also receive interagency review. So for Outer Coast projects, we coordinate with the California Coastal Commission staff, and for San Francisco Bay Area projects, we coordinate with BCDC staff to assess consistency with the applicable planning framework. And because this is a rolling, non-competitive program, this is not a process where we score all of the proposals in a round and fund only the highest ranked applications. We review each proposal on its own merits against these requirements and criteria. That also means that the process can be iterative. So if OPC may reach out with questions, request clarification, or ask an applicant to revise portions of their proposal before it's ready to move forward. Once a project is recommended for funding, it's prepared for consideration by the Ocean Protection Council, and ultimately funding awards do require approval by the council. Okay, so at this point, we have walked through the types of projects Track 1 can support, the sea level rise adaptation criteria, the application materials, and how proposals are reviewed. So I just want to wrap up my portion of the presentation with a few next steps and resources for applicants who are interested in moving forward with a proposal. OPC wants applicants to have multiple opportunities to ask questions and get support throughout the application process. So in addition to today's Q&A at the end of the webinar, we will host virtual office hours each quarter for applicants preparing proposals. For this current round, office hours will be held next week on August 19th at 11:30 a.m. And if you're watching this recording later, please check the SB1 funding webpage for the most current office hours, schedule, and registration information. You can also reach out to OPC staff directly at opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov with program or program-specific questions. We monitor that inbox very frequently. We also maintain an SB1 grant program fact sheet on the webpage, which is updated regularly as new questions come in. Today's webinar recording and slides will also be posted on the SB1 funding webpage, so applicants can refer back to this information as they develop their proposals. And finally, if you need more hands-on support, whether that's figuring out which project pathway fits, developing your project scope, interpreting the sea level rise criteria, or just putting together the application, that is exactly where our Senate Bill 1 Technical Assistance Program comes in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our technical assistance team to walk through the support that they can provide and how to apply.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. My name is Tara. I'm a program coordinator with Coastal Quest, working as part of the SB1 Technical Assistance team. My colleague Sarah Chin is also here with us today. Today, I'm going to talk about Coastal Quest, a little bit about who we are and what work we do, and then I will tell you about our TA program and how we help jurisdictions secure funding under Track 1. Next slide, please. So Coastal Quest, we're a service-focused nonprofit that's based out of Oakland, and this is our mission: to work with partners to accelerate solutions to build resilient coastal communities for people, nature, and the climate. Next slide, please. We have two overarching goals for our organization. We aim to build multi-benefit solutions for healthy and resilient coasts, as well as increase coastal resiliency for vulnerable communities and economies. And all of our programs and efforts support both of those goals, including our work with the SB1 TA team. I will switch to the next slide, please. So the SB1 Technical Assistance Program supports eligible SB1 grant applicants that are facing significant and imminent sea level rise threats along the California coast and San Francisco Bay shoreline. We've been offering TA services for eligible applicants under Track 1 and Track 2, as well as the Tribal Resources Track. We are a complimentary service of the SB1 grant program. We are at no cost to you. And under Track 1, we offer priority for technical assistance to applicants that have communities with environmental justice communities along the coast, small and rural communities, California Native American tribes, or eligible applicants that have meaningful partnerships with tribes, or communities facing locally specific barriers to sea level rise planning, such as being a capacity strap jurisdiction, budget constraints, etc. Next slide, please. So this slide reflects examples of the technical assistance services that we offer under Track 1. This is our standard tableau of services that we offer during proposal development. Whether a jurisdiction is considered low, medium, or high touch is determined by where you fall on that prioritization I just mentioned in the previous slide. We are also dedicated to providing tailored services to our applicants. So if there's a service that would be beneficial that's not listed here, the TA team can make a concerted effort to provide that service, so long as it is within our capacity and expertise. So to apply for technical assistance under Track 1, all you need to do is fill out our initiation form, which I think Sarah is going to put in the chat. Thank you so much. This form should only take about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out. Feel free to submit this even if you are unsure if you qualify for Track 1. There's no harm in submitting the form. And after you sign up for technical assistance and fill out this form, we will follow up with you, schedule an intake call to assess your eligibility, and talk through your project idea. If you are eligible, we will then begin offering our services and supporting you in developing your very own SB1 proposal. I think that's all my slides. Next slide. Yes, and you can contact us at this email here, opcsb1ta@coastalquest.org, if you have any specific questions related to technical assistance. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Tara. That concludes our presentation portion of today's webinar. So we would now like to open it up for questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat or use the raise hand function. We can just call on you to unmute. I'm assuming we'll be able to get to all the questions today, but if we aren't able to get to your questions, again, there's a reminder that there's some office hours happening next week, or you can follow up with us by email. For very project-specific questions, such as applicant eligibility, project eligibility, questions about how the criteria apply to a particular proposal, we do recommend emailing us just so that we can provide a more complete and tailored response. The two contact emails are shown here, opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov. That is for the SB1 grant program, that is OPC staff. And the OPC SB1TA at coastal-quest.org is for our TA program. But do not worry too much about which one you use. We are in regular, constant communication with one another, and we can make sure that your question gets to the right team. And lastly, I just want to say thank you all so much for your time today and for your interest in our Senate Bill 1 grant program. We really appreciate the work that jurisdictions and partners are doing to advance sea level rise planning across California. And we really look forward to working with you, answering questions as you develop your proposals and reviewing your applications. So thank you again for joining us today. And with